you all to be here today for this first phase of CECCUT events. So yes, the idea today was to discuss together about one of the main topics we are going to develop this year. It's about this feeling of attachment to Europe or to any kind of territorial, let's say, entity through culture. So the idea here today was to present, so I don't know if it works, this one. Okay, maybe this one. Ça marche pas, le truc, si? Non, bon.
Pas un bouton du côté.
On-off, mais oui, bien sûr. C'est sur on, donc okay, no problem. So basically, in a constructivist overall approach to the interactions between culture, identity, and territory, we could talk about it during hours and ages. But just to put it shortly, it has been observed that the collective attachment of any social group to its territory, to the territory it occupies. So this idea of having an identity, a sense of belonging to a particular territorial realm, and the parallel recognition of the institution, of the authorities that rules this territory. So this process of both institutionalization and sense of belonging attachment is largely based not only on, let's say, material elements, but also on symbolical or intangible elements. This sense of identity, belonging. And in these symbolical features or elements, cultural features are important components of such process of sense of belonging and recognition of an authority that belongs to that rules this territory. So we could depict it as a kind of symbolical strength of the authority to make a parallel with this image of this concept of the monopoly on violence of the state or of the territorial authority that was developed long ago by Baudin or Hobbes and other different authors. So there is also a symbolical kind of monopoly, the symbolical strength of authorities and of territories linked to the social groups that are ruled by this authority. And in this process of cultural, symbolical attachment to a territory and the authority that rules this territory, cultural policy, that is a policy implemented by the authority in the realm of culture, is actually an instrument to consolidate this capacity building of territorial authority. So cultural policy plays a role in the development of authority over a specific territory and corresponding social group. So cultural policy is also an instrument to institutionalize authority. So this is, of course, emblematically illustrated by the constructing of nation states. For instance, throughout history, the homogeneity of the nation states was constructed to reinforce the institutional authority of the state, especially in the 19th century. And this construction of nation state is not only based on delimiting borders or building institutions or creating schools or whatever, but it has also a cultural, symbolical dimension, as I mentioned earlier, because it's an important component of identification to an authority and recognition to a territory and recognition of the authority. So this is represented, explained by the concepts of imagined communities of Benedict Anderson, or the idea of inventing a tradition. So this concept both relates to the construction of nation states, particularly in Europe, in the 19th century, from the 19th century, also in the 20th century for other parts of Europe, in different parts of Europe. But also it was also analyzed as in the colonial context of the colonial empire when they created common symbols, common images, common also intangible elements so as to create this kind of sense of community, sense of belonging to a common political, socio-political institution, group, community. And in this process, of course, culture and cultural policy is important, as was particularly underlined by Anne-Marie Tisse, a French historian. She made a seminal book on création des identités nationales, creation of national identities. And in constructing these national identities, she pointed out that arts and culture were also instruments mobilized to construct this national identity. And she observes a remarkable convergence of the different artistic expressions to represent identity, national, in this case, identity heritage. So literature, architecture, theater, painting, sculpture, music, creation of national museums and other facilities were all part of building this, let's say, national identity and national authority institution. And we could see in the 19th century, from the 19th century in particular, many artistic and cultural works that contribute to establish or re-establish like state national figures, Germania, Helvetia, Baltica. In the case of UK, we can develop later about this character. Marianne in France, we can think about this painting of Delacroix, the liberty ruling, guiding the people. So also all arts were also participating to constructing this national identity. We can also notice a kind of interesting phenomenon. There was, at the end of the 19th century, so Belgium, the nation state of Belgium was created in 1830, so it's quite a recent nation state creation. And from the end of the 19th century, there was a movement called Neo-Flemish architecture, so it was an artistic also movement. And so the idea was also to value the Flemish past, the Flemish history of the Belgian state, but it was made at this time by the French-speaking Belgian state, because until the middle, let's say, of the 20th century, the dominant language in Belgium and all the elites and the state language was French. So it's quite ironic when we see now the development, linguistic in particular, so this Neo-Flemish past was also promoted by the French-speaking state. This comes from a book about this that I can give you reference. Another example of the important role of architecture as an artistic expression to build a national identity is another movement that took place especially in Scandinavian countries. So we can take the example of Helsinki. There was this national romantic style in also at the end of the 19th century that valued the kind of Gothic past, Gothic history of these areas, of these territories and groups, social groups. And of course it was very important in Finland when Finland got independence and became an independent state, and they built a national theatre, national museum, using this kind of specific architectures that refer to their identity, to their past, common past, imagine, real or reinvented. So we can see here the roles of architecture to value the identity of the state. We can also take another level because this kind of phenomenon of mobilizing arts, culture in constructing a national or territorial identity also takes place. Of course, nation state is very important, but it also takes place at other levels. So the sub-state level, like we can denominate it like a regional level. There is also, we can observe the same phenomenon. So Pierre Bourdieu, the French sociologist, he wrote an important text in 1980 because at this time in Europe, in many Western European countries, regionalization and regionalist movements developed a lot in the 1970s in relations to social evolutions, recognition of diversity, of a need for more democracy, pluralism, etc. So I don't have time to, like a post-68 kind of movements. I don't have time to develop, but so there was a lot of regionalist movements that resulted in creation of autonomous regions in different West, in particular European states. And he made a text in on this topic in 1980, precisely because in France, from 1982, there was a big debate of creation of region, autonomous regions, and so on, decentralized region. And anyway, so in his text about the regional question, Pierre Bourdieu underlines the exceptional stimulating force of the identity matters linked to regional autonomy or linked to creation of region through regionalization. Another scholar, Anssi Passi, who is like a specialist of region and development of regions, he's from Finland. In the pattern that he developed of the different processes and steps of institutionalization of regions, he underlines the fact that regional identity, so that is all these symbolical elements linked to the territorial belonging or territorial attachment, is an essential step in the institutionalization of region, so recognition of a regional authority. And he says that boundaries delimiting the limits of a region, of a territory, and of the social groups that feels belonging to these regions, and identity are different sides of the same coin. He's a geographer, right? We can also quote a work that was made by Hook, Marx, and Shackle about the measuring regional authority in 42 countries. So they did a big quantitative work with different indicators to try and measure the level of regional authority in different countries. And in their indicators, they have an indicator relating to this intangible symbolical dimension called the identity community effect. So they assume that the political capacity of a regional authority will be linked to the sense of belonging, that is to say, the relative strength of the population identity to the community and territory encompassed by this authority. So it comes back to what I've presented you as a postulate of this constructivist approach. And they also assume that where regional identity is strong, one should find more regional authorities that one would expect on eventually grounds. So there is a link, of course, between this sense of identity, belonging, and the recognition of a specific regional authority. And cultural policy, in a way, contributes to this sense of belonging and recognition of this specific authority. And at regional level, of course, if we take like quite strong political capacity regions in Europe, like Wales or Scotland or Catalonia or Flanders, we can see that culture is an important element in asserting this regional capacity, regional power. So there was a lot of promotion of Welsh and Scottish national culture policy specific for that. There was normalization processes of the language, which is an essential cultural element in Catalonia and in Flanders. I don't have time to develop, but you are familiar with the example. We can see, for instance, that in 1996 in Catalonia they built the Teatre Nacional de Catalunya. So it was an emblematic also gesture in order to assert the cultural identity of Catalonia, and this building, refers also to a kind of Mediterranean architecture, so the Mediterranean identity of this territory, and also was built by Ricardo Bofill, which is an internationally recognized architect of Catalonia, etc. And we can see that in 2006 there was a National Theatre of Scotland that was created in the framework of what was entitled the National Cultural Strategy, so national for Scotland. So regional, national, the distinction is always complicated. And you can see the dates. So this took place after this territory, this sub-state authority, gained more power. And devolution happened in 1997 in the United Kingdom, so Scotland was gaining more power. And the democratic transition and creation of autonomous communities in Spain happened in the end of in 1978, right? So you see that culture is also part of this movement of assertion. Also in regions that are less obvious, that are less let's say, famous for defending or asserting an identity, but this movement of mobilizing culture for asserting identity and asserting also territorial authority happened in other regions. So we could see in Spain, in the framework of the Spanish democratic transition, the region of Andalusia basically is not recognized by the Spanish constitution as a specific nationality within a Spanish state. But they wanted, because these three historical nationalities of Spain are Catalonia, Basque Country, and Galicia. And automatically, in the constitutional transition, democratic transition, they were gained more autonomy, automatically, due to their specific history, identity, and so on. The other region had another process to gain autonomy, but Andalusia wanted to have the same automatic and deep access to autonomy, and to obtain this specific access, although they are not recognized as a specific nationality, they did a campaign, a big lobbying campaign to the national government. And in this campaign, they, as William Geniez, who is a specialist of Spain and Spanish autonomous community, and they really mobilized also identity elements, what he called the identity revitalizing, built on the Andalusian folklore. So you see another example in another context, how culture, identity was mobilized to gain more capacity. Also, we can talk about Saxony, which is a German land. So Saxony, when Germany, it's a reunification process of Germany and democratic transition of Eastern Germany. The cultural resource, it's not I only that says that, it's based on text and work on that, but they really mobilized the authority in Saxony, they really mobilized the cultural resource in order to reconstruct the identity of this newly autonomous land of Germany. So they really, they have this kind of motto, Saxony, state of the arts. Dresden is presented as the Florence on the Elbe, etc. So they really use this cultural, artistic kind of image to promote this new state of Saxony in the reunified Germany. So there is a whole political process about it. So they present them as Germany's #1 cultural destination. So if you want to conceptualize a little bit better the relation between identity, cultural policy, and constructing of territory, we can observe two main dimensions, I would say. So first, in this cultural territorial identity, we can find that heritage is an important dimension. All that relates to heritage, so the language, monuments, historically rooted practice or geo-history of the territory, like regional songs and dances, food, craft industry, linguistic heritage, etc. So all this pertains to what we could call the heritage dimension of cultural identity. So other examples, the city of Perpignan in France reused or remobilized its Catalan kind of history and heritage as a political resource to really value the territory, make it more attractive, also develop European programs and partnerships, etc. There is a PhD about this political mobilization of the heritage identity of the territory. Also in the German land of Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, also that was recreated when Germany was reunified. We can observe a movement of valuing this Low German as a language that is official now in this land. So all the document, constitution of the land, etc. can be translated in this language. So they used also this kind of heritage dimension to assert their own identity, so their own authority and particularity in the German Federation. Also in the Aosta Valley, which is a particular region, a bilingual region that has a cross-border region actually of Italy, and that has a particular history. And during ages, throughout histories, they were ruling like an autonomous kingdom, etc. So they have a rich kind of geo-historical identity. So we can observe also text, there were studies on observing that from the 1980s, there was a real promotion of the heritage conducted in this region as an identity defense policy, so mobilization of this heritage dimension to assert the identity of the territory. And another phenomenon is this kind of brand that was developed by territorial authorities in southwest France, so linked to a specific geo-history, a specific heritage, so Pays Cathare. So the authorities and in charge and agents in charge of touristic, cultural and so on policies really developed this brand in relation with European funds, etc., to brand the territory. So they mobilized like heritage, historical resources to foster a new socioeconomic dynamism in the territory, and it has become also a brand for specific food products and so on. So we can see a kind of commodification of heritage elements in order to boost the territory and promote it. So Pays Cathare. But also with the evolution of our society, our economies, and also of cultural policies, we can see that there is another dimension of this cultural identity of a territory, which is, we could entitle, we can discuss that, the creative dimension. Because most of the time the cultural identity promoted by cultural policies that we can observe in some territories include nowadays more and more creative references. So the idea is to value aesthetic innovation, emerging artistic practices, also value the cultural industry competitiveness, and so on. So in addition to, the idea is also to value the cultural identity of territorial entity in its creative dimension, synonymous of attractiveness, economic competitiveness, innovation, etc., in the framework of course, of the knowledge creative economy, what Alan J. Scott calls the cognitive cultural capitalism. This is an evolution of capitalism where immaterial, intangible elements, cultural elements become more and more, have more and more weight as economic assets in our, let's say, post-Fordist economies. And so you are familiar with all these schemes like Creative Wallonia, no? Creative Regions, this is a whole political scheme. So this is, of course, at the junction of culture, arts, but also economy, sometimes social policies, urban planning, development, and so on. I don't really have time to develop, but you are familiar with this kind of creative dimension. UNESCO also launched a Réseau des Villes Créatives, Creative City Network. So to put it in a summarized vision, we could say that identity dimensions of cultural policy encompasses creative and heritage, let's say, references that all contribute, cultural policy, all contribute to reinforce the institutional identity of a social group, so of the authorities that represent in a representative democratic system. So the authorities that represent this social group and the territory on which this authority applies. So of course, I'm going fast on that, but you know that this mobilization of culture, identity to reinforce social cohesion, social political authority, etc., is at variable geometry. It can take liberties with history or with geography, and it can be also, there can be a big instrumentation of that. You are all familiar with that. For instance, nos ancêtres les Gaulois was taught in colonial Africa when this territory, some African territory, was part of the French colonial empire. So this is a great liberty with history, obviously, but it was also a way to let's say, to try to attach the population to the whole national narrative, basically. But we know what the results are. Also in Flanders, many times, in some political discourses, in Flanders, we can hear that there is a unity in Flanders, only one culture, strong identity, strong culture, which is not, I mean, which is not wrong. But sometimes, if you look closer in history, for instance, you can see that the history of Flanders was a lot of divisions between different local, more scales, local entities. So this kind of myth of historic unity of Flanders can be also discussed regarding the real objective history. Also Occitania in France, which basically corresponds to a linguistic area of South Meridional France. But most of the time was reinvented. It's a territory that really has never had any political unity first, but there was a lot of different enterprises of reinvention this territory. And also this mobilization of culture, symbolical elements, etc. Can lead also to promotion of fixed identity, exclusive, defensive identities. It can lead also to intellectual impostures. Emblematic example really being this image or this concept of Padania as a specific, ethnically specific group and territory in Italy, which has never existed basically. But as Keating, with a specialist of regions, regionalism in Europe, said that Padania was invented as the northern community of Europe, but it's really an invention. Anthropologically, historically, geographically, and so on. Padania has never existed. It's just a concept linked to the River Po, and the territory around the River Po. And as Passy concludes very brightly, is that regional identity, to take this one, is just one part of the multiple identities that we have, multiple identifications that we have. And this brings us to, of course, this idea of European Union as an entity, a political, social entity, bringing together different identities, different territories, and this kind of European Union challenge that is to combine unity and diversity. Also, okay, so this what I've just exposed between the links between identity, territory, culture at different fields. Of course, in our interest here in this project, the cross-border context, of course, is a big question. We can wonder how can this cultural policy, mobilization, and so on be to what can be the outcomes, the results in cross-border context. Because first, we observe that cultural policy is a quite important actually field of cooperation. There was a survey by the European Spatial Planning Observatory Network, ESPON. You might be familiar with this organism. So they made a survey on territorial cooperation, and this shows that culture was the second domain of territorial cooperation in Europe. If we have a look at the KEEP database that gathers all data from 60% of the Interreg projects that were developed so far, we can calculate that 10% of the projects were in the culture, arts and identity communities. There is some categories, right? So the two categories relating to culture and cultural policies represent 10% of the projects, which is quite a lot. If you consider that when in a state we have 1% of the budget that is dedicated to culture, it's still, it's kind of already a victory. So 10%, it's 10 more. So they are really present in these cross-border exchanges. And if you take just the culture and the art category, and they have the highest share of projects, so 7.6 of the process projects in the database, because it's a relative figure, because not all Interreg projects are in the database, but as you said, Christian, it's about 60%, whatever. Also, the Association of European Border Regions, they created a specific task force. They have like 4 task forces on health, cross-border health policies, water management, and so on, but also on culture, which shows in a way that culture is an important field of this cooperation. And as this cross-border area are kind of new territory or new territorial scope, or emerging at least, giving way to kind of new organisms that did not exist like 50 years ago. It's quite a very recent creation linked to European integration process. we can wonder what can be the new cultural identity narrative in this territorial scope, based on what we've seen so far. So I propose you to observe and discuss kind of two cross-border regions. So one in the eastern French-Spanish border, Euroregion, Pyrénées-Méditerranée, and here the Grosse Région, Grande Région, here between Luxembourg and surrounding regions, right? So why these two examples? Because we can see that in Euroregion Pyrénées-Méditerranée, so you see he was launched in 2004, you can see here the map. So since the beginning, they had a kind of cultural ambition linked to their political project or policy project, cooperation project. And they launched, they had 4 objectives of the partnership, and culture was one of the objectives, so they really decided to cooperate in the field of culture as an important field of cooperation. So let's see what's happening there. And also in Luxembourg, as you know, and we will develop that deeper and deeper, but they had the specificity, as Anne-Marie recalled yesterday, to be European Capital of Culture in 2007. But it was not only Luxembourg, they really decided to have a cross-border European Capital of Culture, Luxembourg, the city, but Grande Région, the whole system. So Mr. Garcia explained the whole political project behind it, because the big leitmotif of this European Capital of Culture was we are going to create, or at least to reinforce, l'identité de la Grande Région. The greater region identity was really the leitmotif since the beginning. And also the idea was to Perrinize, to stabilize the cultural cooperation with this creation of the Espace Culturel Grande Région that we had yesterday. So that's why they are in a way a quite interesting example of how culture can be mobilized in cross-border context, regarding also what we know already about the cultural identity in territorial context. So what can we observe? So we observe that the projects that are subsidized in the Euroregion Pyrénées-Méditerranée, that is theoretically supposed to represent the Euro-regional culture, or at least cultural policy, right? Are really the majority of the projects mobilize emerging fields, aesthetic innovation, so circus, street arts, dance and digital media, design, photography, contemporary art museum. So it's not top projects about Occitan and Catalan geohistory, even though there was some project about that, but not the majority. No. So it's a first observation that we can make. We could expect, I forgot to say, but the territories of this Euroregion, especially the Catalan part, has got a very strong regional identity, strong autonomy and so on. So we could expect that they would value that, because this Catalan identity is cross-border, because one part, Perpignan, I mentioned earlier. So we could expect that in this cross-border organization, they value that first. But we can see that the projects are more on this domain, let's say creative, in a way, domains. And on the contrary, we can see that in other strands period of Interreg, there was half of the projects in this area, cross-border area, French-Spain, especially in the eastern part of the border, almost, more or less half of the projects were concerning heritage projects, so Catalan language or Roman heritage or medieval dances or whatever. And we can observe in a way a certain transition from 2007, towards more creative or linking to innovation projects and so on, with a big program that was launched thanks to the Sudway program, the transnational interior program, was called Lab Techno Culture. So this is the idea. You see the approach here. There was a big project in Circus, as I mentioned earlier. There was a project about laboratory of future cities, including a lot of creation, culture, and so on. So I don't go into the detail, but to put it in a nutshell, we have really mobilization more of creative elements or creative dimension of the cultural policy in this context, in this cross-border context. So we can wonder whether there is a kind of renewal of identity rhetoric, so from more heritage-oriented to more economic, creative, or neutral, let's say, in terms of identity oriented? Or maybe isn't it also more like a reorientation of the priorities due to the major or global reorientation of cultural policies? You know that the European Programme for Culture is a Creative Europe, so there is a big insistence of this role of culture and the arts to favor economy or economic dynamism and so on. So, you know, linked to the Agenda 2020 for innovation, smart, sustainable and inclusive growth. And so on. So maybe it's more like a instrumental or conceptual repositioning in order to gain, to be more in tune with the mainstream priorities of the European programs. So this is a question, right? What about the greater region? So what about this emergence of a greater region identity? As I said, it was a leitmotif of this cultural event, ECCUT, in the, here, in the greater region. Of course, it was not, it didn't came out of the hat like this, it came because this idea, this project, this political project, came because the idea was to link the strong interaction of the population for commuting reasons, for work reasons, as you can see on the map. It's a region, the Euroregion of Europe, where there is the most commuting, everyday commuting for work purpose. So the idea was also to give more an incarnation of that, an embodiment of these interactions at cultural levels. Create a sense of belonging, of pertaining to a common, also a territorial entity, territorial ensemble, and also it was a territorial marketing strategy, and to position greater region on the European map, with Luxembourg, of course, in the middle, right? But this idea of creating a grande région identity was not such a success as was shown by the different studies or so on that was, or surveys that was conducted following the European category of culture. So they observe a low identification of the population, a low mobility of the publics, and also problems in promoting the events in the whole Grande Région, because you know that the territory is very extended, and it goes from there to there, so there is a geographical issue here. And so one of the main conclusions was to say that it was a cross-border event more for institutions than for population. And anyway, building identity reference does not go without saying. It's not automatic in 1 year. It was very ambitious, as reminded yesterday by Mr. Garcia. And we can see on the map here that the majority of the cross-border projects that were supposed to incarnate this cross-border dimension of the cultural dimension of the greater region, the majority of them happened in a limited circle here between Sarre, Lorraine, Luxembourg, which is also the historical origin of the greater region. So you had very few projects between Wallonia. You see, it depends on the thickness of that, is the number of projects. So very few projects between Wallonia and Rhine-Palatinate, and much more here, because they are also geographically closer. So this idea to have a whole greater region, I mean, the scale was maybe not so relevant, and we know the development of Espace Culturel Grande Région. It appears, maybe you have more information for me, but it appears that now they are a bit not working so efficiently. But maybe the CECCUT project will contribute to redynamize this Espace Culturel Grande Région. We hope that. And just to discuss further this question of identity in the greater regions, many actors that I interviewed and so on, they said that anyway, the identity of the greater region, the main important line that should be valued in the Grande Région, that corresponds more to the identity of the people and everyday life of the people, is really this idea of multiculturalism and multiple identity, because it's an area, especially due to Luxembourg, but also around, that you can find more than 160 nationalities, 42% of the population. These are figures from 2010, so they might have been evolved, but not so a lot. So this is more like the identity of the greater region, instead of talking of a common territory, common history, which is not false, But what characterized the identity of the territory, of cultural identity of the territory, is really a multiculturalism. And this is also due to the history of Luxembourg itself, that has always been a territory of junction, of passage, of interconnection, interface between different influences, in particular the Latin Europe and Germanic Europe, sorry. And throughout history, this territory has been always in constant interaction with its neighbors. We can refer also to the Colpart spirit. So Colpart spirit, what is it? It comes from the name of a castle, where some intellectual during the Second World War were gathered by a Luxembourgish family in the castle of Colpart, and they were really, so they developed a real, they were basically the ferments of the European spirit, or saying we must unite to be together. So it was one of the base of the European construction projects, basically, during the two World War. So this incarnates more, let's say, a kind of Luxembourgish or Greater Region identity than saying, than referring maybe to I don't know, Lotharingia or this kind of medieval formation. And the fortified heritage in the Greater Region shows a bit that. It shows that it was also a territory of passage, junction, and also of borders, of course. And now the idea in Europe is it's an emblematic territory of the reinvention of the European borders, right? And it's also, the Greater Region, a diversity lab, as many Euroregions are, laboratories for diversity. It's a very common image of cross-border areas, but here it's even more salient due to this geohistory, due to the fact that the first European Union, the ancestor of European Union, sorry, was created around here, around the coal and mine industry in this kind of area. And we can observe also that the Greater Region in itself has become also a study object, an object of study, especially regarding this diversity issue. And just to terminate, so what can we learn or at least observe in this cross-border Euro-regional context regarding cultural policy, territorial identity, institution construction? And we can see that there is a permanence of instrumentation of culture, so you're not going to be surprised of that, but it's interesting to also maybe talk about it. We can observe also, they can learn us that they confirm in a way that identity, heritage and culture, of course, are very plastic notion, so constructed notion, reconstructed, evolutive notion, and not essentially given notion. We can also see that this context, these objects, and this will be one of the objectives of CECCUT project, are important to try to reframe the cultural representations, because we are in a different territorial context, political context. So in terms of representation, it crosses the different levels with the EU in a filigrane. So it's a specific space to reframe our representations, but also the cultural practices, the cultural policy as practice. Because they suppose to gather different institutions, organisms work together with borders, different administrative systems. We mentioned that yesterday in the workshops and so on. So they are also interesting arenas for that. And they show that policy instruments and schemes must be, in a way, reset, rethought, and adapted. To new context, what we could call, I don't know, this is also a polemical term, but post-national context, as we are now in the European Union. And anyway, we can also observe from field work and so on that for us artists and cultural stakeholders, there are also new opportunities. These cross-border schemes, cross-border projects and so on, there are new framework for them, and to test also and to practice their own creativity, new imaginaries, etc. So there are also new options at a more pragmatic way. And we can see that artists, creators are very important, also actors, in order to try to reframe not only our representations but also our policy schemes, right? So, of course, many questions remain open about culture, cultural policy in cross-border context. So, on one hand, Euroregions can appear as steps in the construction of Europe of culture, Europe of territories, and so on, but also kind of mirrors that show us problems or deadlocks of European constructions. They are like mini Europe in a way, so with the same also problem at other scales, but also steps in constructing Europe. So there is a kind of ambivalence here. And in a way, they incarnate also this kind of European Union equation that has to be solved, equation or challenge, is to form one demos, one common people in a way, but from different territorial cultural identifications rooted in history, in territory, and that are not going to be replaced. So how can you solve this equation? This is the question we have also to try to think about here. And just to terminate, it's a quotation from three German sociologists that made a tribune in Le Monde in 2012. So it was at the beginning when people still started to understand that there was a big problem here with different questioning representative democracy and so on, and you know the story. And so they had this tribune in Le Monde with Habermas, which is the most famous of the three, probably for you. They say that Europeans have a model of society that can be valued and that is in a way expected in the world, but that has to be also carried on and reinforced. And they say that to renounce to European integration would be prendre congé, l'histoire du monde, so would be to prendre congé, to renounce in a way to the global history. So just as a conclusion, thank you very much.
Thank you. So now we have a session of about 20 minutes, half an hour questions to Thomas. So please.
I can start. Thank you, Thomas, for the presentation. And the last quotation. Yesterday, so I want to talk about during the workshop about the mantra of Europe, unity in diversity. And he said that, okay, it's nice, but the word of diversity is really ambiguous. Where will we go with this? Do you want to converge toward the unity? So we don't care about diversity, or we want to keep the diversity as a force to build the European identity. So first, I think it's an interesting question to help to answer this challenge of how building a European identity for the Europe. So first of all, just this remark. And I rebound with the analytical framework you presented at the beginning of the presentation. You said that to build this identity, you need to have a collective attachment of a social group, and you need recognition of the authorities. So if I take this analytical framework to analyze the building of the European identity, I have some doubts about the success of this. And maybe you can talk about this because you focused your presentation on the regional scale, and really to help us in the project to think about how to help the European, or to help the European integration. What will be the key questions to create this common or shared identity in Europe? Maybe it's a bit fuzzy, but
No,
it's reflection.
It's a very important question. So European Union, unity, diversity is really it's a motto, it's a mantra, but it's also a challenge. As I said, I like to mention it as an equation because really it's like a calculation and you have to find a solution. And of course it's not obvious, but the idea is that European Union is not going to substitute so far as a new state or as a new authority or a new identity. It cannot replace the existing identities that are based on different historical, geohistorical structures that we all have in Europe at national, regional, federal, whatever level it is. We have such more different states and so on. But at the same time, European identity, you have to have an identity attachment or a symbolical attachment to build a political entity. It's a fact. Yeah? So there is a combination here to find, and some observers, not only I, but there are some. There is the idea of federal Europe. This is one entry to that, saying that Europe could be, European Union in the end could have a more federal approach. That is to say, like in multinational states, because some states are multinational, that is to say, with different, as recognized and lived as multinational, like Canada, Switzerland, or there are examples of that, or multiple cultures, multiple nations that coexist in the same state, in the same federation, because this exists in a way. So there is this idea that Europe could inspire or get inspiration, European Union, because Europe is another scale, could get inspiration for this. But we can see that this approach also has got deadlocks, limits, especially with now in the moment when we see that Europe and authority, European Union authority is really in the hands of the states and nation states, in the national state governments. So there is a whole challenge here, and there is not, I don't think there is a ready-to-made answer or solution to that. And it's also a matter of will of the social groups constituting Europe. Do we want to make Europe together? If we want to make it, we must also accept a certain a new layer, identity layer, and also political layer and social layer that is the European layer. If we don't want to make it, we don't make it. But I think the danger is to stay in between as we are now. I think this is a danger or risk or the weakest situation in terms also of identity, precisely, is to remain in between 1 foot in Europe and 1 foot in European Union, and 1 foot outside. I think there is it's like in the institutionalization path dependency model of development of institutions. I think we are in a turning point, in this model. I think there is a turning point, as there were before in also period in Europe. So I don't really precisely answer to your question, but it was not such easy bet.
You have mentioned the identity of Europe, and when you look sometimes at the literature, they will say there are two types of identities in Europe. There is a political one with democratic system and all this Habermasian approach of cultural identity in Europe, and there is something more related to history, heritage, the art, all that. And then you've got the regional identity, and you've got different type of regions. You've got urban regions with metropolis inside, or more rural regions. And in nowadays, there are more and more populist parties at different level, state level, regional level, and they play the grassroots people against the Europe, against the elite. And so they can use regional identity to play the cards against Europe. So do you think that populist parties in cross-border regions, they can develop a discourse about regional identity in Europe, which is more adamant, more structured than, governmental parties who are more central?
I think it's like, it's a matter of diversity actually. I would say it depends on the region. But if you take Bavaria, for instance, they have a strong kind of regional identity, but totally included, I don't know, we have German and France here, but quite included in the German Federation with no reaction, but still they have their own identity. But they have quite an open approach to Bavarian identity. I mean, they don't have problems, even though there is also fascist parties or fascist trend parties in Bavaria. I'm not saying that, but still, so, and they have a strong identity, and there are other cases, probably where xenophobic party or, I don't know, because populist, I think, it's difficult, but let's say populist parties, we use the regional identity, but I say it depends on the situation. And I read recently an article about the Italian case in Lega Nord, which is this Padania, and originally they mobilized this regional invented discourse, including ethnical and xenophobic elements in it. But now they transformed that discourse. Salvini now is in responsibilities in Roma, so he's a national, he's got a national function. And so he transformed totally his discourse to adapt it to also southern Italy. So southern people in Italy that before were the enemy of Lega Nord, or the people we don't want to listen to them, we want to. So it's very variable. So they mobilized at one point, and Lega Nord is very interesting in terms of evolution of this discourse, because at one point they stopped with xenophobic arguments, because they saw it was not really functioning well, to have better cause. So they say now everybody is welcome, etc., as long as you defend our political project. So also immigrants that will defend the ideas are welcome. So there's no article about that. So they mobilize regional discourse, but then they change, and now they have got a national and also binational discourse or transnational discourse, because they are trying to align with other extreme right parties like Front National, typically. They are very friends with Marine Le Pen. They print T-shirts with both figures, faces on it, for the European campaign. So now they are transnational. But basically their basis was regional, but so it's very evolutive, I would say. So I don't know. And you have regional cultures that are very open as well. If you take Catalonia, for instance, and at the moment you have the problems, of course, but traditionally the Catalan nationalism or regionalism, but identity rhetoric, let's say, is not based on ethnical elements. It's just based on recognition, practice of the language, of some tradition, on civil rights approach, that from Middle Age was the civil rights in Catalonia and Catalan were different. So it doesn't have, it's an open identity, because it's a territory with Barcelona, which was a harbor, Mediterranean harbor. So they are always been open to many influences from south, west, east, whatever. So they have a regional, strong regional identity that has political, strong today consequences, but open kind of. So I would say it's a variable, and I don't know if regional scale would be a favorite field work for populist parties, but it has to be mitigated with also look at other work, because probably if you do a broader study, you could see that, of course, but it has to be mitigated. And also the case, the case of
Scotland.
Populist parties are not more present only in countrysides or little cities. Some studies have shown that we could believe that, but they're also present in big metropolises.
Moi aussi, je voudrais intervenir, mais en français.
Oui.
Puisque tu as terminé là d'une manière très, très intéressante avec cet extrait renoncer à l'histoire, l'intégration européenne serait prendre congé de l'histoire du monde. Donc ici, il s'agit du sens de l'histoire. Quel est le sens de l'histoire? Quel est le sens de l'évolution? Et alors, je me demande, puisqu'on discute maintenant sur les régions, sur le transfrontalier et tout ça, Si l'on ne peut pas identifier dans le sens de l'histoire des derniers peut-être siècles un certain égoïsme des identités, c'est-à-dire un morcellement politique qui suit le renforcement des égoïsmes identitaires à des échelles de plus en plus petites. On a eu des grands empires, donc qui ont perduré pendant des siècles, et à un moment donné, la philosophie du pouvoir étatique a changé vers des égoïsmes identitaires, les peuples, les nations. Et ces nations ont engendré, de ces nations sont issus des pouvoirs politiques nouvelles, c'est-à-dire les nouveaux, les États. Maintenant, il y a une philosophie qui tente de descendre les identités et leurs besoins de pouvoir, si vous voulez, peut-être au niveau des régions. On ne sait pas. Je crois que pour le moment, on est encore dans une étape de recherche. Cette philosophie des arguments de l'identité régionale n'est pas encore arrivée au niveau de l'idéologie qui puisse ensuite se transformer dans une idéologie politique et dans une prise de pouvoir politique. Ou peut-être elle essaie, mais pour le moment, elle n'a pas réussi. Peut-être que c'est celui-là, le sens de l'histoire auquel fait référence Bofinger, Habermas et autres, ou quel est le sens de l'histoire jusqu'à la fin, comment on le perçoit ici. Ça va aller vers le morcellement de plus en plus, parce que le morcellement de la société, la vie sociale, est de plus en plus atomisé, et on assistera à un morcellement politique comme on l'a eu autrefois. Par exemple, l'espace allemand, il y avait environ 300 États, et qui ont fleuri. Le centre de l'Europe a un héritage extraordinaire. C'est une question qui est plus ou moins basique, si vous voulez, mais puisque tu es parti du sens de l'histoire, tu as conclu sur le sens de l'histoire, peut-être que cette réflexion, où sommes-nous et vers quoi nous nous dirigeons, c'est une possible réflexion, je sais pas.
C'est intéressant de prendre la figure de l'empire. C'est intéressant parce qu'il semblerait que territorialement, cette figure aussi est pas complètement.
Comme je suis géographe, je pense aussi aux relations entre pouvoir et territoire. Et je constate, les derniers siècles, ce processus de réduction de l'expression territoriale du pouvoir. Et en même temps qu'avec une métastructure, l'Union européenne, et peut-être une métastructure globale, la globalisation triomphante.
C'est ça. Déjà, l'ONU, on constate qu'il y a une inflation d'État à l'ONU. Le dernier en date, c'est Monténégro, je crois. Alors, le Monténégro, oui, non, c'est une région. L'Espagne, elle n'a pas reconnu le Monténégro.
La Roumanie, non, pas Monténégro, peut-être Kosovo. Kosovo.
Oui, alors, pardon.
C'est Kosovo.
L'Espagne, je ne sais même pas si elle a reconnu Monténégro, je ne sais plus.
Je ne crois pas. Monténégro est reconnu, mais c'est le Kosovo qui a des problèmes. Il est reconnu seulement par 120 États et pas par le reste.
Et la figure de l'Empire est intéressante et il semblerait qu'elle ne soit pas totalement territorialement, en tout cas, et culturellement. Du coup, aujourd'hui, on voit apparaître pas mal de choses autour de cette figure-là. Alors l'Empire, évidemment, à l'époque, c'était basé sur la conquête militaire, coloniale, etc. Mais cette espèce de, comme tu le dis, de chapeau territorial ou de gouvernance commun, mais dans une grande diversité d'expressions. Comme a été d'ailleurs l'URSS. L'URSS a été en pointe pour valoriser la diversité culturelle.
Ou la Yougoslavie, qui à un moment donné faisait belle figure d'État modèle d'entente, d'intégration, et à un moment donné, tout s'est cassé.
Voilà, alors on a pu croire que c'était la fin de l'histoire et tout ça par rapport à ça, mais c'est pas sûr. Oui.
Oui,
is it possible to continue in English because there are some?
Yes, of course. Of course. I just wanted to remind you that Ulrich Beck and Edgar Grande wrote a book. I don't remember exactly the title, but the notion of empire was absolutely a cosmopolitan empire, as Europe, as a figure of Europe, was absolutely included in this book. I wanted to ask, it's continuing to Christian's question, I wanted to ask you a question that maybe it's too complicated now to answer this question. Are there some surveys, some reports about the political configuration in cross-border regions concerning the European Parliament next elections? Is it possible at the moment or not to have some ideas, anticipation of which parties, traditional, new, etc., could be dominant at the European Parliament, or is it impossible?
We must do it for the project. No, I would answer that we talked about that yesterday in workshop. There is a big problem to gather common statistics, common data, because of the national border, because national it's a classical of all cross-border scholars. Except here they try to develop an atlas or whatever, but it's still very difficult to. So I don't know if it's possible, if it exists, because you would have to access the statistical system, but they are not European, they are still very national, because statistics was also an element in constructing nation states, and you can see that all regions, when they get more autonomous, typically they create their own statistical office, because statistics is a way to control the territory, population, and so on. So I don't know if it exists. I saw a map about the political tendency in the region, at regional level, first sub-state level, that was produced, I don't know by which organism, but it was not cross-border. But if you take this map and you draw the cross-border region on the map, you might have some
resources.
And they made color, it was red for center left, blue for center right, and so on.
What we could do,
But I don't know, Christian.
yeah, in the framework of the CECCUT network, we could ask to the cross-border ECOCs during the European elections to get some data about how local people voted for the elections. You know, because I know that in France we will have the data for each communes normally, but in different countries there are different ways to look at how people voted. But then what we can do is to contact the cross-border ECOs, which are in networks, and by the way, we would like to know exactly how people voted for the European elections there. And it could be used for an article or something to look at it.
I think it's possible to obtain the data at the net 3 levels. So it's department in France or Kreise in German. So sometimes it's quite a small scale to obtain the results. And I think in the Eurostat website, maybe in June or July, we will obtain the
That would be
data
interesting.
for all the borders in Europe. We have to do that for sure.
But with Frédéric, we made a survey in Eurometropolis, Lille, cultural-territorial, so cross-border area. And we observed that some people, they practice every day the border and crossing the border, but at the same time, there are very reserved comments on the European Union, so it was quite interesting to see that. Because they do Europe, like Mr. Jourdain doing prose without knowing it in a way. So they do Europe every day. They wouldn't understand that they cannot cross easily to go, but at the same time, they see that European Union is not a project for them, or it's. Ça c'était intéressant. It was interesting. So it has to be, of course, developed. With this data, would be better and interesting.
There are just a few remarks. I remember one professor in Basel made a micro-survey. It was the micro-sociology analysis, and he followed some people who live in the south in Mulhouse and who work in Basel, and he interviews one or two people who vote for the Front National, for the extreme right, and you work in Switzerland. You say, I like to go to Switzerland for working, but I hate Europe, I hate the others. So there are contradictions in this.
Kind of schizophrenia, border schizophrenia, we said. But it's also it has to be substantiated. Where does it come from? One thing is to observe it, but also to interpret it is another story, basically.
We tell curiosity, which happened in our border. Let's say I'm from Nova Gorica, Slovenia, Italy, and we will bid for we are candidate city, and let's say 10 years ago it was not possible to join two Goricas to go into the project like this. So I think what happened, many things of course, but also another thing which happened, and you will not notice it in elections or whatsoever, no? Why we improved our cooperations, let's say, because 2 or 3 years ago, when the immigrants came into Italy, into the border, not in Slovenia, into Italian border, and since this impact of immigrants, now if I say in lower debate, they say meglio slavo che nero, which means better Slavic than black person. So it's really but yeah, it's really unbelievable. And now some families put their children, Italian families, put their children into Slovenic school in Italy, because there is a minority, Slovenian minority, which was quite impossible before, because the Slovenian schools are more pure. They have only Slovenians, not immigrants. So it's a very difficult thing. We improved our cooperations and our relationships and so on, but on which basis?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, there are other things, of course, also the mind of the people is different and so on, of course, absolutely. But yeah, one of the things is also the mayor who was elected 2 years ago, he's from Berlusconi and not just very right, extreme right, but he never speaks about cooperation, and before he was never speaking about cooperation on the other side and so on. It was not a topic. Now it is, absolutely.
Yeah, adjustment of the discourse, yeah.
You just say something about definition of identity by differentiations, and actually the populist parties will play that in Europe to say that there is an enemy outside Europe, and Europeans are a cohesive ethnic group, and so the danger is coming from the outside. But about statistics, it's true that they have to be used in a very to be very careful. It's just because people have different identities in a way, and the way they interact with researchers or in their family or in their work institutions, they just display a multiplicity of identity, and they're all existing. They are not. They can be contradicted, but they can manage on a day-to-day basis these contradictions. I think that the elections of populist parties in border regions, for me, is just would reveal a crisis of identity in these regions. The fact that the discourse which is produced on regional identity in Europe, what people feel as members of this regional identity and how they feel themselves, there will be something wrong happening there, which will have to be explored, investigated through qualitative research as such. But it will be really about identity crisis if you see that a lot of people vote for anti-European parties in these border regions.
Yeah, and as I said before, identity is a very important element of cohesion, of social political entity or democratic entity, etc. So as long as European identity will be fragile, I think European construction will be fragile. So Of course, the economy can be very efficient, liberal, cross-border exchanges of products, goods, and also persons, tourists or whatever. But if European identity remains fragile, if you look at the process link between authority, institutional, and territorial identity, European construction will remain fragile. But of course, an identity that is not a state identity based on the 19th century history, it's not a regional identity based on the 20th century regional revivalism. All things considered, these processes can be different from Central Europe, Southern Europe, Northern Europe, because there was an Austro-Hungarian Empire on one hand, and so on, you know what I mean? But it cannot be the same process. But I think one fact is that as long as it remains fragile or not consolidated in one way or another, the European polity will remain fragile. And being in between is, I think, the most problematic issue now. Yeah.
But don't you think that you could reverse the analysis?
Mm.
So you say if we lack a strong European identity, we will lack a strong political project.
Mm.
I would say the reverse. Maybe like Denis Rougemont, who said you won't find European identity just like that. Let's work together and we'll find out at the end what it is or what it is not. And my analysis would be rather than let's have a strong political European project with many layers, with many proposals, and so on.
And then to contribute to build, yeah, sure.
You already have an identity, for instance, in work. The fact that you have a Europe of universities, a Europe of workers, and so on. You have already layers of identities just like that, because people work together, because they get to know each other, and especially in the artistic and cultural field, which is one of the most mobile and European addicted, let's say. But you need a political project.
This is the question of recognition of authorities. And if I follow your idea, it's the identity that just the results of all the interactions, people, politics. And with the notion of identity, I have some problem with this. I don't know what is it exactly. And sometimes when I reread this quote, maybe we have a European spirit. European spirit exists because of all their history. And maybe this is the basis of building something. And of course, we have to build the institutional dimension first. And after, it will be the results of that.
It's a very wide issue, because maybe the European identity is not it cannot be based on language, because we have 24 official languages without counting the sub-state languages, etc. But some analysts said it's more based on values than on. So the European identity should be based on values, common values that we all have. But how do we define it, who defines it, etc. And who will have the courage to define it? That's the problem. It's also a matter of political courage at the moment. It's a big problem, this.
Do you actually think that a stronger political European project is possible? Federal Europe, or what do you understand by a stronger political project? Because the opponents of Federal Europe are arguing that Federal Europe will go against the cultural specificity.
No. I mean, when I talk of a stronger political project, maybe I'm a little on the line of Jürgen Habermas, which means you have, let's say, a European nation based on politics. And when I talk about politics, it's not only at the institutional level, of course. Of course, you have the European Parliament, you have the European institutions and so on, but it's also a question of the civil society, the empowerment of the civil society to make proposals. You have, for instance, now in the treaty you have a certain article, I don't remember which, excuse me, but it's a possibility of a European initiative.
European citizens.
When you are more than 1 million coming from different countries, you know
1
this.
million signatures.
There are ways, small. I recognize it's very small, but there are some ways of another political participation of citizens throughout Europe. And I think that it's not only a question of the institutions, it's really a question of you and me and everybody. I don't know if I'm clear.
Yes, but in fact it can work with the elites, mobile, you can speak many languages, but for the vast majority of people in Europe, they haven't. I mean, I saw a very strange statistics, but for instance, Britain, which is a global country in a way, you see that 3/4 or even 80% of the British people still living less than 10 miles where they were born. So it's a way to show that people are really living into a space of places, to talk as geographers, and not in a space of flows, except very mobile people, elites, artists, I mean, researchers, okay, but these Europeans are really convinced that Europe works, then okay, youngsters, they can go abroad. Tourism exists in Europe and it's encouraged a lot of flows, but if you see in Britain now, British people always go abroad in Europe for their holidays, but then a majority of people to vote to leave Europe. So the mobility in itself is not necessarily enough to convince people to stay in Europe, and there is a cultural issue of how we are structured within states, within nation states, and the way we consider how we can constitute our identities by differentiation with people living on the other side of the border at different scales. So that's
basically a basic definition of identity is based on similarity, acceptance, and whatever of similarity and solidarity. So can we achieve that at European level? We could, including cultural aspects of it. And c'est a sense of similarity of another person, and also solidarity. So we could combine that maybe. There is a European identity. If you take to a Chinese person, he comes to the room, I think he will think we are all European and
yes,
cliché,
evidently.
And if you go to China, you take to people from very different communities or groups, ethnies or whatever, they know their differences and we will consider them as the same culture, you know what I mean? It's a bit cliché, but we have a problem to recognize it at political level. So
we take a last question and then we go to the presentation of Alexandra.
Sorry, yeah, I don't know, I do struggle with this whole European identity thing because it almost seems like, okay, for example, NATO is has a very clear goal or a very clear objective as to why it exists. The European, economic space has a very clear objective as to why it exists. The OPEC, clear objective as to why it exists. European project seems to be kind of half clear economic, very rational thing, and half almost religious to a degree. Like it's religious in the meta level. I'm not talking about the specific religion. I'm talking about this, we're more than human sort of thing, which I think is a very confusing way to look at it, and I think that's why we probably struggle with identifying what is this Europeanness, because we haven't really defined as to what we're trying to define. So in a sense, I don't know if we're ever going to define it to a degree where you were saying, well, as long as the European identity is weak, the European project is weak, and I'm just going to say that I don't think it's ever going to be strong, because it's there is a lesson to be learned from, let's say, the British Empire or any empire really. You know, the British Empire doesn't exist anymore, but the British Commonwealth does. So there is a difference there, you know, and analyzing those differences, I think, is something that we can learn for ourselves. Maybe we don't need to go towards an empire because we know that it will collapse eventually. But the Commonwealth and the idea of the Commonwealth and why is it called that way and what does it, you know, constitute, could be like a wiser. It seems fragile, but in the end, it's actually in long term, it's stronger. It's more flexible because, you know, when we talk about an empire or a federation, then it's a really fixed entity, and maybe it's exactly what makes Europe good is the flux that is, you know, that is innate to the European Union. So in that sense, I don't really see a problem with the, you know, the weak identity, because I don't think we're ever going to have a strong identity. We're too different. We really are. You know, even whatever Nebraska and Florida in the United States are very different states. You know, having trouble communicating, although they have the same language. So in that sense,
identity.
Yeah. So it's, you know, yeah. So anyway, don't see a problem with that too much. And second is that we have a lesson to be learned from empires, commonwealths, and things like that have existed before.
It's what I said, the image of empire. If you refer to British Empire, of course, it's a bit out of date image, you know, like any colonial empire, or we could talk about the Roman Empire. But the image of empire, the object of empire that is conceptually
but the mechanisms
here is more, you know, at territorial and cultural level, that is to say, very flexible, precisely, you know. Not in a colonial attitude. So it could be a commonwealth, but commonwealth is limited to trade, you know, relations.
But at the same time, it has a clear objective. And as long it has a clear objective, though, or like a clear point as to why we're doing this. Because when you start arguing about the identity, then you lose most of your audience, because they're like, what is this? Like, what are we talking about? Like, if you give me extra 100 euros per month, I get that. That's understandable. You know, but this identity thing, blah, 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 blah. And unfortunately, we're talking about mostly those kind of people that we're trying to enforce an identity onto. So that's what I'm saying. Like, Commonwealth, although it is limited in a certain way, I think it's actually more concrete than in some other things.
It's a trade agreement that we already have in European Union. Yeah. And yeah, of course, yeah, Commonwealth is a good.
The point, basically, what I'm trying to make is
objective, but what you pointed out is really what is the European project, and the problem that has Europe, what I was saying before, is that we are talking a lot about responsibles and so on of Europe are talking about a European project, and we don't really know what it is, and this is a problem, and this is where the anti-European parties occupy the space.
I guess my question is more of why rather than of what. I don't think what matters in this case. I think what matters is why. Why do we have this in the first place? Why do we have it in the first place? Why do we need it? Why do we want it so badly? You know, what do we benefit from it? Stuff like that.
I think that any state, any political power develop discourse about identity, and even national identity, regional identity, there's always a discourse about identity. You cannot escape from it. Europe develops constitutive of many beings and powers around it. And so Europe simply used all the symbolism of the nation state, with the flag, with the hymn, with the euro. Everything is related, they're duplicated at an upper level. Can we escape from it? Well, it's very difficult to just have an economic project on its own, because maybe it's not going to work and people can decide to leave all that, but it's very difficult to avoid culture. And when you mention about this quasi-religious approach of Europe, we have to be aware that the founding fathers of Europe, a lot of them were Catholic churchgoers. You know, there was a strong Christian dimensions of unity in diversity in Christianity in Europe. There is something about it at the origin. And so there's also an identity behind it. And now the Populist Party, they want to use this Christian identity in Europe again, but not to accept differences, but to show that we are Christian and there are Muslim enemies outside us. You know, we cannot escape these identities. I don't think it's why we use it, but what can we do with this identity discourse and how people can accept it and how people reflect from it. Even if we are not European, we have an approach to Europe. Even if you are anti-European, Europe is within you and you define yourself with Europe. So, but I think that now we could thanks so much for his presentation.